Hello, Lisa.
Hi, Gio. How are you? We'll be getting started in just a few more minutes. If you're watching on YouTube, we are going to be getting started in just a few more minutes. Okay, Don is here.
Okay, Zoom is almost up. Okay, join with computer audio, even though I don't have my thing hooked up. Okay, everyone, welcome back for our afternoon session. Good to see you all. Hope you had a nice lunch break. Let's just set our motivation really briefly for the afternoon, just to refresh our motivation of bodhicitta. So we won't do a full meditation, just sit silently for just a short while, and then I'll lead you in setting motivation. And just recall that these teachings that we're getting are really so precious because they're the way out. They're the answer to the dilemma that we are all in, that all beings are in. And we should feel so grateful for the great masters upon whom we depend. The Buddha himself, who Tsongkhapa is praising in these verses, Nagarjuna, Buddha Palita, Aryadeva, Chandrakirti, Bhavaviveka, these masters that we've already spoken of a little today. Then, of course, all the contemporary teachers that we have, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Kyabje Zopa Rinpoche, Lama Yeshe, all these beings who are in a very real way involved in our lives, giving us teachings, helping us on our path. Now, if it wasn't for the kindness of all of these beings, or their having dedicated themselves to a path of awakening, we wouldn't be here. And what is it that they want most for us? To become like them, to follow in their footsteps. And we do that by setting our motivation to achieve Buddhahood for the sake of all beings, exactly as they have done, all these great masters. And the mind that is essential if we are ever to be of the greatest benefit to all beings. So just refresh your motivation of bodhicitta now, so everything we do becomes the cause for that result, our own enlightenment and the enlightenment of all beings. Okay. So maybe just check in to see if there were any questions, if you discussed things over lunch a little. I don't know how many did, but or even thoughts that you had that you'd like to bring up before we continue. Excuse me a moment. Yes, please, Laurie.
I don't know if this is on topic, but it seems like concepts are our problem, and also the way we somehow we have to hold on to them and let them go at the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the conceptual mind, I mean, there's a whole field of study in Buddhism that we do called mind and cognition, where we look at even kind of how the mind knows, and conceptuality is the main way that we are, through our mental consciousness, relating to the world around us. And I would say that most of what we do with our conceptual mind is probably pretty much not in our favor, where we initially are grasping at things as real through that mind of ignorance, and then we are overlaying all these qualities on them that they don't have. This is all happening. All this superimposition, fabrication, elaboration is happening through our conceptual mind. And so in that way, we can see that it's a big part of the problem. In this tradition, though, we don't have this feeling of like, oh, then I need to just stop all my thoughts, like stop getting the conceptual mind arising so that I can be in some sort of non-conceptual space. We do eventually realize emptiness through a non-conceptual mind, and the idea at Buddhahood, Buddhas don't have conceptual minds. They are like this spontaneous force of just enlightened energy and activity going on all the time. They don't wake up and go, should I help Lori today? Well, she seems to be in a pretty good place. Maybe I'll help John instead. Or I mean, they don't think through like that, like the way we think. They don't have conceptual thought. So we can say to some degree that conceptual thought is the problem, but only the conceptual thought that is not in line with reality. Because as we see in getting together on a weekend like this, we're trying to get a conceptual understanding of emptiness and of dependent arising, because those concepts are important to have before you can actually achieve a more direct realization. So it is a part of the problem, but it's also the major part of the solution, to get us on that building up to eventually what is a non-conceptual understanding of emptiness and eventually a non-conceptual existence in Buddhahood. But for now, just to have an awareness. What's that wonderful phrase? It was on a lot of bumper stickers. Don't believe everything you think. Well, I wouldn't say don't believe anything you think, because that's really dangerous, right? We do have some things, even conventional thoughts, that are just perfectly fine. They don't get kind of crazy. Don't believe all the garbage that our minds create, because it's not something you want to keep buying into. But we still have to, exist in the conventional world with some level of conceptuality that is not tainted as much as we can with those sorts of things. But moreover, we have to generate the really wholesome conceptual thoughts, because that's the bridge to getting out of here. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, just so you know, conceptuality knows things in a very indirect way. We in those studies of the mind and how it knows what's called epistemology, the epistemology of the mind. They say that conceptuality, and if we think about it, that's kind of what's going on. We're always working with kind of something that is not the actual object. It's an idea of the object. We call this the generic image or meaning generality. Like if I ask you to think about your mom of this life, whoever you consider that to be, if you were not raised by your birth mother, whoever fills that role, you can bring them to mind and have a visual image of them. You might even think of their voice, so you might have an audio image of them. That's not really them, right? It's just an idea of them. If it was your mom, then your mom would be here, right? But your mom's not here in front of you. Your mom is an idea, a concept. And that kind of generic image or idea of what your mother is what we work with when we have the conceptual mind. Just like with emptiness and dependent arising, even, we're trying to generate a meaning generality, an idea of what these concepts are. Eventually that does fall away when you have this direct realization of emptiness. You no longer have that medium between you and the object you're trying to know. And they say at that point, emptiness and the mind knowing it, they become like water poured into water. There's no longer a sense of a separate object and a subject like the conceptual mind does. So there's some interesting things. It's a course well worth studying. It's a little difficult, the epistemology part. But I was saying the other night when we were talking about faith, that there are another branch of that study that's Buddhist psychology, where we look at all the various contents of our mind. Again, what Venerable Rabina calls all our crazy roommates, all the various things that are going on in our mind that we need to be aware of, so we can sort out what are the thoughts and things we want to follow, what are the things we want to abandon. So that's a nice part of that is well worth taking. But the other part does get, like I said, a little complicated, but conceptuality is a big thing, an important part, again, of our liberation, but also obviously a big thing that's keeping us bound up in all of this. So, pardon? Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear quite all.
We've been indoctrinated.
Right, exactly. And Buddha would say even indoctrinated before birth in prior lives, because we continue thinking in the same way, essentially, not just this life, that we've been indoctrinated into ways of thinking and holding things. But we also have things we carry over from our prior lives that kind of come together. We were talking before the break about that sort of thread of consciousness that kind of carries with it all of our karmic imprints, all of our seeds and predispositions and all of that. It's not just like, doesn't shed all that at the end of a life and then regenerate all of it. It actually is all carried forward. And what we do with our minds is extremely significant, because it doesn't go away. It carries with you. So. Okay, good. Any other questions or comments? Those online or? We do have one here. Alex is going to ask a question.
Do you have any thoughts, suggestions on how we integrate it into our daily life?
You mean how to integrate what into it?
The dependent arising?
Oh, dependent arising. Okay, I just wanted to make sure we were. Maybe I'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow. How do we integrate it into our lives? Obviously, the degree to which we have meditated and reflected on these subjects is going to have an influence on the degree to which we can integrate them. To really think about everything that we're meeting in terms of those two natures of the fact that they arise from causes and conditions, their parts, that depend on their parts, that they are in the end merely imputed, designated, and how that brings about an understanding of emptiness, that they don't have any inherent existence. So I'd say, yeah, there certainly is an ability to do it. Let me. I didn't really include that as part of my agenda thing, but I can talk about it. But I feel like it'd be better talking about it towards the end rather than now. But remind me if I don't. That's your job then, Alex. Okay, I've given you a job. Yeah, Don has a question or comment. Yeah.
One comment was this morning I was thinking, I'm reading this little textbook on 8 verses of mind training, and I thought some book should be written, a Buddhist book that says we should learn how to talk to ourselves, because the negative mind is constantly talking to us, and it's only when we are aware of that, that we can reach into the Dharma medicine cabinet and pull out one of these 8 verses and, apply that wisdom to help, eliminate that negative mind state, that delusion. And so sometimes, the conceptual mind is like our best friend. When we say, I'm a piece of crap, I'm not worthy, no, I'm unlovable, blah, 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 blah. And makes up a lot of conversations. I think people have a lot of negative self-talk. I don't know how much, what percentage it is, but it's the majority of our conversation. And so being able to recognize it and then have a little Dharma medicine to, to put, to apply to that. Anyway, I think thought transformation really is about talking to ourselves, I think. Would you agree with that?
I would agree, yeah. It's about changing our conceptuality so that we embrace more wholesome ways of being in relation to whatever's going on outside of ourselves or inside of ourselves. But absolutely, the self-talk is horrible. I know Kristen Neff, who teaches on self-compassion, she says that if we talk to friends in the way we talk to ourselves, we wouldn't have any friends. Seriously. And we beat ourselves up so much. If we beat everyone else up, they'd be like, the hell with you. I get enough from myself. Why should I get it from my friends? Right? So it's good to be mindful of it. I do find that this word mindful, we need to, I think one of the things that is valuable about the mindfulness practices that are becoming more secular and generic in a sense, but they teach you how to have a deeper awareness of what your entire mental landscape is. I've had a lot of students who've come from like the Vipassana traditions and things and learned mindfulness really, really well. They weren't necessarily practicing it in the way that Rinpoche encourages, where he always is like, well, mindful of what? But even just being present, learning to be present with your thoughts and see them arise and take shape, and then, be able to do things like you said, Don, to apply an antidote at the time, to bring in some Dharma medicine that completely obliterates that. You need some awareness. You need to be actually paying attention. You need to be present. And I don't know that we put enough attention on that in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Kind of assume everyone's going to be able to be their own therapist in a very intimate way all the time. And that's something you learn through a lot of these practices of, Mick mindfulness, as they sometimes call it these days. But it's practice for a reason, because if you are more present with what's going on, then you are attentive, you're alert, you're constantly on guard, if you will. I don't know if you have anything to say on that too, but.
That sense. Another sort of side, a different point that I thought about a few minutes ago that so relevant, and you mentioned it, that a Buddha doesn't have conceptual consciousness, so constantly, without having to think, compassion and wisdom, but particularly in our tradition, compassion is so emphasized that compassion is just constantly flowing, doesn't need conceptual mind to create it. But I remember something that Jeffrey said, or at least he was explaining a little verse from Chandrakirti, and it's something to the effect, and I'd like you to expand on this because I'm not sure about it, but it was like one, particularly bodhisattvas have compassion for all sentient beings. They understand the emptiness. I mean, when you ask the question, how does emptiness help you develop compassion? That would be a good question.
Right.
And understanding that sentient beings are completely obsessed with the mistaken perception of reality called inherent existence, which draws us into so many problems.
Absolutely.
That this compassion just naturally arises, just noticing the vast amount of suffering that's brought on by misperception of reality. Would you, I mean,
that's essentially the understanding. In the beginning of Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way, he pays homage to great compassion because he sees it as the source from which all of this good arises. And if we look at, again, that first verse of our text that we're studying, I mean, it's like through the Buddha's compassion, this is why he taught dependent origination and all of this, to release sentient beings from the trap that they're caught up in, the prison they're in. And that's really, and one of the levels of compassion is to bring an awareness that all of these beings that we're observing through the lens of our compassion, bodhicitta, and what have you, are empty of inherent existence, with the kind of additional thought, and they think the opposite, the exact opposite. Through their ignorance, they are holding themselves to exist inherently, and it's not there at all. So when we get that level, your compassion is said to grow even greater, because you know that this is something that can be defeated, of course, because of all the teachings that we're looking at, like in this weekend. People don't have to be this way. They don't have to suffer. I sometimes use that phrase that, I mean, it's all unnecessary suffering. Every single moment of suffering beings go through is unnecessary, at the level of it's only there because they're buying into reality in a way that is not real, is not the final view. So I don't know, that's the concept behind it. It's like a way of advancing your compassion, to bring these two things together. Again, we talk about wisdom and compassion as being the two birds, the wings of the bird that get you to enlightenment. You never want them to be completely divorced from each other, because again, they are very interrelated. Our wisdom mind understanding the lack of inherent existence and the dependent arising nature of things, and then the compassion that embraces beings within the understanding that they are under the control of this ignorance and deluded by it and suffering because of it. This is what will get us there to the final result, is by holding both of those awarenesses together as much as possible. So, because I mean, it's one thing to think, oh, well, sentient beings are suffering and I really don't want them to suffer, and that's a great thought. But if you don't have the means to undo that, which is what the wisdom wing is, it doesn't get you very far, right? And other traditions, spiritual traditions, might say, well, we have the means to relieve the suffering of others through Jesus Christ, our Savior, or through whatever means that they have. The Buddha teaches a means that is each of us individually becoming our own Savior through realizing these teachings. But we need, obviously, the teachings themselves. That's why we need the Buddha, why we need Lama Tsongkhapa, why we need to become a Buddha ourselves, is so we can help beings to have this medicine. But absolutely, this is a way of enhancing our compassion. And we will touch on this idea of kind of when it comes down to utilizing our wisdom of emptiness and dependent arising in how we can relate to others. And that'll be a part of even Alex's question of kind of how do we make these teachings more practical in our everyday life. Okay, are there any other questions? Maybe just one more before we go on. I don't want to take too much of our afternoon, but no, nothing. Okay. All right, let's carry on then. So I think we made it through the second verse, more or less. Before we go on, though, I actually might mention that, in Buddhism, well, we can say ignorance is a pretty big word right in and of itself. We've been mainly honing in on this idea of ignorance of the nature of reality. That's the big one that we're obviously trying to counteract. But in those teachings on Buddhist psychology, when they break ignorance into subdivisions, they actually include a second one, which is ignorance of the law of cause and effect, ignorance of karma. They said essentially all of the lower rebirths are caused by not being aware of the effects of our actions. And so we end up in these unfavorable states of existence, and we pop up out of the lower realms and get a human rebirth, but then we only practice non-virtue and we end up going plummeting right back down. But most beings live with some ignorance of this intricacies of the law of cause and effect. They might have some idea that I want to be a good person because I have some fear of some repercussions of that. Even in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's some idea of that. They don't have, again, a full knowledge of karma. But this is one form of ignorance, and it's good to have an awareness of that. That's why that's taught prior to the teachings on emptiness. But it's a part of dependent arising, right? Karma is the way in which sentient beings experience various things in samsara. It is a causal process. So that level of ignorance is important to overcome. But then the big one that we're talking about here in this verse, where we say, that sentient beings are under the control of ignorance. I'll get that on the screen. Whatever degenerations there are in the world, again, the root of all these is ignorance, meaning that ignorance of the nature of reality. But we can say that also sentient beings suffer because of other forms of ignorance. There are myriad forms of ignorance, but the two main ones that are highlighted in Buddhist teachings are those: ignorance of the law of cause and effect and ignorance of reality. Okay, so that's the main gist of verse 2. Let's go on then to verse 3. So how can an intelligent person not comprehend that this path of dependent origination is the essential point of your teaching? So again, given that the main reason that the Buddha taught dependent origination is to undo the ignorance of sentient beings, how can we not, get this message loud and clear that dependent origination is the essential point of your teaching? Again, we looked at this a little bit with the verses not of our text, but the other verses that we looked at last night, that were kind of speaking to the fact that everything the Buddha taught could be considered a teaching on dependent arising, the Four Noble Truths and so on. But, the mind realizing dependent origination is the pathway, is the doorway out of here, is the way that we are actually going to be able to overcome all of our problems and be free of it once and for all. And that's the essential point of the Buddhist teaching. They do often talk about how the Buddha came and taught kind of two main results that we are trying to achieve. One a bit more temporal, which is, again, by paying attention to the law of cause and effect, overcoming our ignorance of that, we can gain what are called, it's generally referred to as high status. It means good rebirths. Well, we want to avoid the lower rebirths, not just because we suffer, but also because in those lower states, you can't make good use of that life. In a human realm, like we all are now, we've got lots of opportunity. This is amazing, the human intellect and our ability to investigate these teachings. To be able to pick them apart. Some of us might take longer than others to pick them apart, but we can do it. We've got minds that can actually analyze, can focus, and so on. But then the second result that the Buddha was really helping us to achieve is the one where we have to undermine the ignorance of the nature of reality. That's to achieve, the phrase that's used there is definite goodness. Definite meaning certain, in that you will continue to have that goodness. Unlike high status, you get the goodness for a while of being born as a human, or maybe even other higher realms, but the human realm is said to be quite ideal. But it's not certain you're going to always be in a human existence, right? It can go south pretty quickly, make a few wrong choices, and suddenly you're plummeting back down into the lower realm. The certain goodness is liberation and enlightenment. And we, just so you know, are generally using those terms to refer to the goal of the more fundamental vehicle path, of those who just simply want to extricate themselves, remove themselves from samsara, cyclic existence, or enlightenment, which goes beyond liberation. And you remove both layers of obscurations I spoke of earlier, whereas those who simply want liberation remove just the afflictive obscurations. So again, both of those goals are definite goodness. If you achieve them, there's no going back. It's not like, I do get this question sometimes, well, was it that we all fell from grace? We were all Buddhas at one point, and then, there was something bad in the salad or something, and you got sick, and suddenly you're in a bad place. No, that's not how it happens, right? It happens simply because we've always been in this state. And we've never been Buddhas. We've never known freedom from this ignorance. And once we get the wisdom that is able to release us from that, then we achieve that state and there's no going back. You don't have to do it again. I think it was in one of Dr. Nick's teachings where he said, one of the problems is we continually are putting all this effort into samsaric happiness that we just have to keep creating again, right? It doesn't last. It's not something we can take with us. But if we put all of our effort into achieving liberation or enlightenment, you'd have something that lasts. It'd be over. And don't we want it to be over? I'm kind of tired of it, frankly, and I'm just talking about this life. I can't even remember all the prior lives, obviously. So, so this is the thing. Certain goodness or definite goodness is the main goal. But to get there is going to probably take some lifetimes. That's why the other goal of high status is important. Keep getting good rebirths. Keep planting the seeds through paying meticulous attention to karma, which again is reinforced by under the teachings of dependent arising. We have to create the causes and conditions for what is ideal. They don't just happen. We didn't all plop into this human rebirth for no reason at all. We created the causes for this. It said we even made prayers for this. Well, are we taking this life and making prayers for our next life? Are we creating the causes through our actions to plant the seeds for that? So again, everything the Buddha taught revolves around those two ignorances, in a sense, helping us to, have the goal of good rebirths, high status, but moreover to achieve liberation or enlightenment. And in order to do that, we need this kind of path of dependent origination, which is in that verse. This is the pathway out of here for yourself, and then, of course, to achieve Buddhahood eventually so that you can then help others. All right. Yeah, we use this word path frequently in Buddhism. It simply means kind of a consciousness. It's not meaning like a physical path, obviously, in the woods or what have you. But it does, it's something that leads us in a particular direction. Okay. Let's carry on then with verse 4, the last of this section about reasons for praising Buddha's teaching of dependent arising, dependent origination. This being so, who will find, O Savior, a more wonderful way to praise you than to praise you for having taught this origination through dependence? So again, this is just a carry on of all three of these verses are all about seeing the value of the teachings of dependent origination, that beings need this so badly to be free of their suffering, that it's the essential point of everything the Buddha taught. This is the most wonderful way to praise the Buddha for teaching this. We use this, it's kind of interesting. This is a Thupten Jinpa translation that we're working with here, where he uses the term savior. I know Rinpoche was quite fond of this word savior and wanted it used in many of our prayers. Just those of us who do come from a Christian background or what have you, it's not the same as we've already discussed. How do the Buddhas save us? Again, by teaching us the Dharma. It's not a personal savior that is going to, you devote yourself to and they will rescue you from all of the unfortunate things in samsara. It was pointed out in the commentary by Lobsang Gyatso, Venerable Lobsang Gyatso, that this is the fourth time that we've had a mention of dependent origination. If you look at it, it's in these three verses, right? The last line of this, origination through dependence. The previous one, the third line of the one before. If we go back up to the top, it's right there, dependent origination, and taught it. It's kind of an interesting point because the Buddha, it hasn't even mentioned emptiness yet, right? And emptiness is really what you have to realize to unlock get rid of all of the obscurations that I was discussing earlier. But dependent arising is the main point to realizing that. Again, it's the king of reasonings, the royal reasoning, if you will, if you don't want to get into gender. It's the one that is the perfect pathway out. If we realize dependent origination at the deepest level, we will realize emptiness. Because as we saw in that one passage earlier, dependent origination is emptiness. Emptiness is dependent origination. And we're not making them absolutely equivalent, but understanding that these are the two things that are bound up in this, developing this wisdom that will actually help us to be free. We will see emptiness appearing in the next verse, though. So just so you know, it's not a term that Tsongkhapa is avoiding per se, but rather kind of waiting to talk about when he's already introduced dependent origination well. So I don't know if there's much more to say about those first few verses. Let's go on then to the actual praise of the teachings on dependent arising. So again, he's praised the Buddha, that's the actual praise and so on. Now we're going to look at the praise of dependent arising, these amazing teachings that the Buddha gave. We get a brief presentation in the first 4 verses, verse 5 through 8. The outline heading for this is expressing amazement at the teaching that phenomena are non-inherently existent because they rely upon causes and conditions. It's because of dependent arising, especially through causes and conditions, the first of the 3 levels, that the Buddha and Nagarjuna and others posit that emptiness can be realized. And again, we'll see that the lower schools, the schools that are not at the level of Prasangika in terms of their philosophical dimension, actually would disagree. They say that, this doesn't prove the lack of inherent existence, dependence upon causes and conditions. But according to Tsongkhapa and all the masters that preceded him in the generation of this middle way view, they say absolutely, that's enough to prove emptiness, is to say that things lack inherent existence due to having arisen from causes and conditions. So I'm just going to read the first 2 lines here. This is in quotes, whatsoever depends on conditions, that is devoid of intrinsic existence. This kind of saying, this is the sort of advice that is being given by the Buddha and the Prajnaparamita in these teachings, that this is in and of itself enough, the instruction to allow us to realize emptiness. As I said, we have great confidence in the law of cause and effect when it comes to our physical world, right? And the attention we pay to causes and conditions, to look at again what happened during the pandemic and understanding once we had a good idea of what the virus was and how it was transmitted, and then you stop creating the causes and conditions to be exposed to it and you don't get it. This is something we relied upon. We relied upon that knowledge to be able to avoid getting it, or some of you may have gotten it because maybe didn't have as careful attention to that, or perhaps, other things that played a role. But nonetheless, this is how we go about living our lives, is with a very fine attention to creating causes and conditions. And even animals do this to some extent, right? They know where to go to build their homes or nests or whatever, and make sure that something isn't going to happen to their young. And they have great knowledge of kind of paying attention to the law of cause and effect in our world. But the deeper import of that, most beings haven't gotten right. That because things arise from causes and conditions, they have no independent existence. Therefore, they are empty of that. They are free of that. The gakcha, as we said earlier, this object of negation, can be completely removed, completely undermined through the understanding that things arise from causes and conditions. So as I was saying earlier, we do have kind of one of the problems in realizing emptiness. I know there's plenty of problems in realizing emptiness, but one of them is the fact that things do appear to exist this way. And as I explained, that is caused by us having assented to this appearance for so long. Remember that threefold process again. As Rinpoche says, something appears before us that's a basis, and we learn the label. And most of us learn the labels for many things when we were young, but there's new things all the time, right? Remember, it was kind of funny when the first iPad was introduced at the Apple store down in Albuquerque. They had a news report because they all went out there, reporters, to interview people, because there was a huge line outside the Apple store to get this. And they asked one person, they said, so you were here to get the Apple iPad? And he says, oh, yes. He says, do you know what it's going to do? And the person said, no, but I want it. So like we might not even understand the full ramifications, that we just hear Apple iPad and we go, yeah, I want that. Apple Watch or whatever, they keep having different devices. You might like just in your own mind even create a desire for something without necessarily even knowing what it is. But that first level is where we simply learn the label for something. The problem doesn't exist right there. We have to label our world. Like I said earlier, we organize our world so we can function in it. That's how, imagine if we didn't have a way of kind of relating to things in our world, how would we even communicate? This is one of the marvels of the human race as well, is that we're very efficient at communicating with each other, not always skillfully, but nonetheless, we have an ability through language and through symbolic language even to be able to say things to each other and get to know what's going on in the minds of other beings through them expressing themselves and so on. So again, language is an important part of it, but whether you're learning the term in terms of a linguistic term or whether you're learning the idea of what something is, this first step simply happens. And that's totally fine. If we stopped there at the first step, smooth sailing. But we have a mind that's conditioned through this ignorance to have the second step happen, which is it then appears to be real from its own side. As soon as we learn the label, it's like the label absorbs into it. And all of a sudden, there's no differentiation anymore. In fact, Jeffrey Hopkins, in his book, Emptiness Yoga, he says, the label we give to something and the basis that is designated to are two separate phenomena. And he says, if you don't get the real import of that to where you fall apart and just think, God, this is just really profound, then you haven't thought about it long enough. The label we give of, for example, hand, and these 5 fingers and palm and so on that are designated as hand, these are two separate phenomena. And it makes sense, right? Because if they did exist inherently, then hand would be these 5 fingers or 4 fingers and a thumb, if you delineate it that way. It would be here. This would be hand. And as I said, we wouldn't even have the first step necessarily, because this would have handness screaming at us the moment we saw it. It'd be like hand, 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 hand. We didn't learn this as hand until sometime later, right? When our parents said, oh, that's your hand. And you go, oh, hand. Wonderful. I'm glad I have a hand, 2 hands. But hand and this stuff here that we designate as hand, 2 separate phenomena. That's the real meaning of the emptiness of intrinsic existence as well. Everything is, again, simply labeled. And then we go to any one of these pieces of the hand, my index finger is labeled to this. Index finger and this are 2 separate phenomena, 2 distinct phenomena. Related, sure, because this is the label, index finger, this is what is labeled. But that which is labeled and the label itself are distinct. They are not the same. If they were the same, they would exist intrinsically, right? Okay? So the first step happens. We learn what something is and give it the proper label according to conventional wisdom. And we decided to call this hand in English. You could have called it, gorp or something, and that would have been perfectly fine. It's a term that could be used. And as long as we all agree we're going to call this a gorp, well, then that's what it is. Right? Okay. Hope I'm not saying like a really bad word in some language when I make up words. Okay, so then the second step happens. It appears back to us as if it's real. That's through the force of this imprint of ignorance that we've had since beginningless time that is forcing us to never be free of that appearance. They say, in fact, the only time that you're free of that appearance is when you are in this meditative equipoise, it's called, on emptiness. At that time when it's the water into water experience I talked about, where you have this immersion experience into emptiness that is non-conceptual, that is just revolutionary, they say. It just changes your mind completely. That initial experience, you never go back from that. You never believe in things anymore. Until you have that experience, you've never been free of that appearance of inherent existence that is arising in that second step. When you come back out of that meditation, as was said in that one passage we read earlier, in the subsequent period, you do have that appearance arising. But again, you don't believe it because you've seen reality. You know that things don't exist that way. That must be a pretty weird experience when you come out of that and you go, wow, everything's appearing real again, but I know it's not real. Again, it's similar to the lucid dreamer, the person who's able to be in their dreams all the time with the awareness of them being simply dream objects. So you never get excited about it. Something really delightful happens, you just go, oh, that's a dream object. Something really horrible happens, you go, oh, it's just a dream object. It doesn't have any reality within the sphere of dreaming. It's a similar thing, I think, for those who come off the cushion after that direct realization, who those things don't have any power anymore. The appearance of inherent existence doesn't draw them in. But for all of us, we go to the third step really quickly, like almost instantaneously. We think it's real from its own side. We think it has its own entity, that it exists objectively. Okay, so this is the process that we're all engaged in all the time. Trying to think what comments I want to share from here. Look at some notes again. I put all these notes together the last few days. It was kind of fun, but it's also like, trying to kind of figure out where things are going. Because sometimes I'm mentioning things before I have them in my notes, and then I kind of am repeating things. I don't want to repeat things too much. I think it is good to have some repetition of these teachings, obviously. But again, if we go to this idea of the way to undermine all of this process is by understanding, Lama Tsongkhapa saying in this citation that he's doing in those first two lines, that it's through the reasoning of understanding that things arise in dependence upon causes and conditions that we'll be able to undo all of this. That the third step won't happen, that we won't have the conceptual thought eventually. We'll get rid of that, and then eventually we'll get rid of the appearance, and then we will simply be with this unbridled awareness that can then benefit beings. He's saying that essentially it's through realizing the dependence on causes and conditions. Now, Venerable Lobsang Gyatso, in his commentary, he does say that in his estimation, even those people who profess there to be a creator God have some still understanding of cause and effect, right? And they still would subscribe to much of what we do in terms of our conventional existence. But even when I was debating with one of my Catholic, or no, he wasn't a Catholic, he was a Orthodox Christian friend down in the interfaith group, he had no problem with saying that like a creator God could be the beginning point of all of this and could bring all of that forward. I mean, he still wanted to find some causal factor. Just his estimation, the causal factor was creator God, as opposed to Buddhism, which says that things are created through karma, through the minds of beings, and so on. So again, if we look at what is propounded within that idea, though, of a creator God, and as we were discussing earlier, Jack isn't back here yet, but he was bringing up, the idea of this soul and what the soul is and so on, which I still query. It does seem to have this unchanging quality in the midst of all of that. So there is a bit of an inconsistency philosophically with saying that everything in the world and kind of our experiences and all of this that's going on is a sort of changing phenomenon that depends upon causes and conditions that go back to a creator God, but yet there's an unchanging essence that goes through all of it. Something that is kind of, again, identified to a degree to be equal to who we are, the self. So Geshe Lobsang, I don't know if he's Geshe, I don't think he was a Geshe. Did you ever know Lobsang Gyatso? He was the one who was unfortunately killed quite some years ago. You knew him, Don? Yeah. Because he lived up in Dharamsala, right? Yeah. I never had that good fortune, but I've read a few other of his books, and I really think he was quite an astute scholar. He says, yet when we examine these ideas more closely, such as this unchanging essence, there's a problem with asserting such unchanging phenomena in the midst of an ever-changing world. How can an unchanging God, for example, create a universe? This is another thing that might be posited about God, much less the soul. But if God is a sort of permanent, unchanging phenomenon, well, then how does God create things? How is there a process of causality that starts from something that is unchanging, when everything we see is in the process of change? How can a self that is unchanging in this soul, this kind of unchanging soul, transform into an enlightened being? We obviously see there'd be problems in kind of subscribing to that idea. So he then goes on to talk about how in Buddhist tenets, essentially we have come to abandon such ideas. And as I said, there's a denial of this sense of Atman. In fact, we could say that the initial teachings on selflessness the Buddha gave were anatman, that this is a negative, a no Atman. Atman does not exist. And of course, it wasn't just that I was talking earlier and kind of saying, yeah, can you point to me, what is that Atman? Where is the basis for that? There's also just the idea that it doesn't make sense logically, as he's pointing out, to say that there could be a transformation of something that is permanent, unchanging, into something else. How does that happen? If it's unchanging, how can it possibly change? So the Buddhist schools, this is kind of the coarsest way that there is a refutation of what we would call the self or the I. We use self in different contexts. Here, for the next short while, I'm going to be using self to primarily mean this sense of I that we have, that we carry with us all the time. There is an I that exists, we'll come back around to that, but there are different elaborations and ways that we talk about that. And the coarsest one, the one that kind of is the initial refutation point for the Buddha, especially at the time he lived, and the locale he lived in, where all of these Vedic traditions were subscribing to this sense of Atman, was that. And it's kind of interesting. He also delineates this as being something that is only fabricated within a particular life. It's not something we actually carry from life to life. Unlike the other obscurations that we have that are innate, that do carry on from existence to existence. And when I think about it, I mean, it does make some sense in that way. You know, when sentient beings are raised in that, do they have a natural inclination to think that they have a soul or Atman? I think you have to kind of learn that. It's not something that we have innately. But this is kind of a self that seems to be delineated, and I've got this, trying to think of where I actually have these slides. Now, before I jump ahead to that, let me go ahead and introduce you to these schools of thought that are negating this. We're going to go back to the slides for a little bit. These other schools, and we talk about them all the time, sometimes we refer to them, unfortunately, as the lower schools, but they, in terms of their philosophical view, it's not the highest level. By other schools, Losang Gyatso says, we mean the schools that formed in India in classical times prior to the transmission of Buddhism from India to Tibet. Conveniently for beginners, the Tibetan tradition has classified the abundance of views recorded in the classical Indian Buddhist texts into 4 main groups, the last of which has 2 subdivisions. And again, when we go through these, I will be delineating where they have particular views to some degree, but all these Buddhist schools will refute this coarsest view of a self, without a doubt, because it's, again, something that is taught to you. It's acquired in this life. It's not something that we carry forward from life to life. It's not of the greatest concern to the Buddha, but it is one he had to refute to even get into the ears of these followers of the Vedic traditions and so on. The first one, and this is just so you have these, I'm not going to explain them in great detail. What is said to be kind of the lowest school of this hierarchy is the Great Exposition School, Vaibhashika. The next one, the Sutra School, Sautrantika. These first 2 are primarily concerned with negating that sense of self, and another one that is coarser, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. When we get to the third and the fourth, the mind-only school, Chittamatra, and the middle way school, yay, we've arrived at Madhyamaka or Madhyamika. This is the higher views that the Buddha gave that are based on the Sanskrit sutras. And why I introduce you to them is because we do hear these frequently in the teachings, especially of the Dalai Lama. In fact, I found it kind of interesting when His Holiness taught in Paris. When I was living over in Italy, we would generally go to wherever he was teaching in Europe, and he taught in Paris for, I think, almost 7 days in 2003. And he said, I'm going to take the first 2 days to give you an introduction to Buddhism, and then I'll talk about the text, which was Nagarjuna's commentary on Bodhicitta. He was going to talk about that the remaining days. In the first 2 days, like the first lecture, he's using these terms of Vaibhashika and Sautrantika and all this, not really beginning Buddhism. But this is a way that in Tibet they went back and they structured kind of the teachings that the Buddha gave. It's not that the Buddha taught them with that particular label, but they structure them into 4 main tenet systems. There is even a course, again, in the FPMT's basic program where you study the presentation of tenets and get to understand the refinements of their views. And ideally, In another world, we would learn those coarser views first. We would learn to refute the things that are a little easier to refute before we jump into the deep end of emptiness. But hey, folks, that's where we're at. You must all be good swimmers from prior lives, or you wouldn't be here. Okay, so hopefully you're in the right pool, and we're all able to kind of make our way through that. But it is kind of nice to go back and look at their views, because their views make some sense, and there certainly is an agreement that the Buddha would refute these things. It's just sometimes they don't go far enough. Remember that analogy that I shared with you yesterday that Jampa Gendon gave to us, of like they're wading into the lake and they're getting deeper and deeper in water. And you do kind of learn to shed some of these views, but you keep holding on to the final one as some sort of life preserver. Well, the ones at the middle way level are the ones that say you have to get rid of that life preserver. And it's not until we get to even the subtlest view that is within what's called, again, the consequence school, because 4A and 4B here, the offshoots, the two main schools of the middle way, the Madhyamaka school, are the autonomy school of Svatantrika, and then the consequence school of Prasangika. By the way, these things in the letters that are in the parentheses, most of you know this is Tibetan in what's called Wylie. It's a way of being able to delineate what the characters are in Tibetan through the use of English alphabet. And there are only a couple of words where it doesn't work quite right. It's really quite a nice tool to be able to know what word you're referring to, because some of them sound the same, because there's suffixes and prefixes and all these other things going on in Tibetan words that are a little complicated. But so it's only at the level of the middle way that you actually begin to see the full import of dependence upon causes and conditions, and it's taught to its greatest depth in the consequence school. This is why, again, you've got this little hierarchy of these various tenet systems. So, let me do some talking before I get to that slide. So although the lower schools do agree that things don't exist in the way they appear to some extent, there's always some level of kind of maya or illusion that's going on, something that is happening that is not in line with reality. For the lower schools, they are primarily looking at the person as the main object to where there's some deception happening. And again, coarser views that eventually get removed through investigation and so on. But it's only until you get to the higher schools that you actually see that the Buddha is also teaching that the phenomena in the world around us are also having this illusory nature, and we need to see things as they are. And they would all agree, of course, that there is some level of causation involved. As we know from, I actually saw one of your stickers, Don, you put together of the Buddhist slogan of dependent arising. The Buddha was teaching dependent arising all the time, just not at the level of this depth of understanding that it points to emptiness of inherent existence. So again, although they do, hold to some of this idea of causes and conditions and things being a bit illusory, none of them, even all the way up to the Svatantrika, that autonomy school that's a subdivision of the middle way, none of them question inherent existence. None of them question that things have their own entity. So this is the problem. I'm just making a little footnote here. When we don't study things from the beginning, if we go to the end, read the end of the book first, we get to the Prasangika point of view and we really understand it. It's hard to figure out why people don't get it, because we've at least started to see for ourselves that things don't have this way of existing. But we have to kind of throw that to the side if we're going to really understand these coarser views that are negated. But Nagarjuna's view, of course, in terms of his point of view, was said to be ideally, the consequence middle way school. He's talked about as being the founder of the middle way, that branch of the tenets that the Buddha taught. But he was teaching the consequence middle way school. As I mentioned earlier, Buddha Palita is the one who refined it so that we could really understand at the deepest level these teachings. So he put it forth in terms of being able to understand that we do need to go that far to negate inherent existence. That if we had inherent existence, if it did exist, causality would be impossible. So understanding that causality exists through dependence upon causes and conditions is already a doorway to understanding emptiness of inherent existence. That's the prelude to these verses. These are the very first verses of the chapter 24, which again is on the Four Noble Truths. An opponent is coming forward. This is like one of these lower schools. That's why I introduced you to them. It's somebody who is kind of not holding the final view that Nagarjuna held, that we are investigating this weekend. This opponent in a debate comes forward and says, all of these Four Noble Truths and so on, if they were void, if they were empty of inherent existence, they would not arise or pass away. For you, it follows there would be no Four Truths of the Noble Ones. So essentially he's putting forth that the lower schools are saying that if things were empty of inherent existence, nothing could exist. It couldn't arise, it couldn't pass away. The Four Noble Truths wouldn't exist. They're holding tightly to this view that dependence upon causes or that emptiness of inherent existence refutes dependence upon causes and conditions, which is like the exact opposite of what we're trying to get at, right, in the Prasangika middle way. We're trying to find the compatibility of these two. But the lower schools are coming forward and saying, well, if things didn't have any intrinsic existence, then they couldn't arise. Causes and conditions wouldn't play a role. The Four Noble Truths wouldn't be inexistent at all. For them, the Prasangikas have fallen into the nihilistic view because we've negated too much. We've gotten rid of the thread of what keeps things existing, because for them, inherent existence equals existence, right? Because they think that, and let's use the example of like I don't know, do pea sprouts come from peas? I always want to say a pea seed, but I don't think it's actually a seed. I mean, maybe it's like, I don't know my, CJ, do you know? If you would plant a pea, right? And eventually from the pea would come a sprout, right? Okay, good. So what they're saying is that when you talk about the pea that acts as the seed for the sprout, that is in the continuum of the sprout, that it has to have some sort of inherent pea-ness. Oh, that sounds horrible. I didn't realize I was using such a weird example. Pea being. Maybe let's use another example. Let's use an apple seed. I'm turning red now, I'm sure. Let's use an apple seed and an apple sprout, because I'm sure there's a sprout that comes out of an apple seed. I've never seen one grow, but I would imagine, there's something, when the seed breaks open, and you have that process of similar to sprout that comes up, and then it eventually becomes the part of the trunk of the tree and everything that grows from it and so on. So you have that, we're talking about that moment when the apple seed and the sprout is coming out. We have this feeling that there has to be an appleness, that works better, than kind of inherent within that causes the apple sprout and all the whole process to happen. So you get apples from this whole wonderful process, right? This is kind of the conventional way of looking at things, is that things have to hold their own entity. There has to be something findable. This again is our gakcha. This again is what we're trying to refute, is that there's some sort of inherent essence there. The Buddha isn't denying that this is an apple seed and this is an apple sprout and it becomes an apple tree with apples and all the various things that are involved. That's conventional dependent arising, that things happen in that way. He's just saying there's no inherent apple seed, no inherent apple sprout, no inherent apple tree, no inherent apples that grow from it. The entire process is lacking any inherent existence and yet still happens. But for these lower schools and for most people in the world, they are adhering very strongly that things have an intrinsic essence. They have something from their side that dictates what they are from their side, not from merely being imputed, merely designated by my mind, calling it an apple seed and an apple sprout and an apple tree and so on. So the problem that the lower schools are putting forward is that they are then saying to the Prasangika Madhyamakas folks, us in the room, you guys you're taking away utter existence, because how can apple sprouts arise from apple seeds? How can apples come from apple trees? None of this can happen if there's no apple essence, no intrinsic existence within that whole process. Yeah. Makes some sense because again, this is how we relate to the world too, through our ignorance. We think that there's something there from the side of the object. In fact, we're going to use another example that's used frequently a little bit later to really, really help that the penny to drop on that. But we're convinced of that reality because we feel like if you take that reality away, if you say there's no appleness, apple essence from the side of that apple seed, the whole process falls apart. No, the Buddha says, yeah, there still is a process. You still plant the seed, and the seed has a sprout, and all of it, through all the causes and conditions, you get apples from that tree eventually, after some years. No problem. It just doesn't have any intrinsic existence. So the middle way point of view is a bit challenging for us to get to because we do have to negate an awful lot, which we are ingrained to think. That there's some sort of essence of maroon color in all of these little chair backings that are here, right? And the cushions on the floor. That the maroonness, the burgundy, whatever color you want to call it, I call it maroon, but anyway, if that isn't there, then how could I detect it? How could I have any relation to it? It has to be abiding out there on the object, the color of it, the taste of it, everything around us, all the phenomena that we experience. It's got to be abiding in the object. And we experience it in a very dualistic way, that comes and enters into our field of experience and seems to be holding its own entity out there. So for the lower schools, they say, you Prasangas have a real problem. You're falling into a nihilistic bent. You're going too far. You're negating too much. Okay, so we go on to the next slide, we see kind of Nagarjuna's reply. I think there's actually even a little commentary, though, that I've added in here from Lobsang Gyatso. It says, moreover, according to the lower schools, if the four truths were not established from their own side, but were just some kind of mental designations, how could we speak of attaining this truth and abandoning that truth? And what benefit would there be in it? If we were merely imputed in the radical way the consequentialists describe, how could we wander from one life to the next? Right? All of these things that the Buddha taught don't make sense to them if things don't have some intrinsic identity. Otherwise, it becomes for them just like a big soup of nothing, right? And we're just imputing this is this is that, kind of have this willy-nilly designation of things. Things have to have their own identity, or one thing isn't, the truths of suffering and the origins of that, and the other isn't the truths of cessation and the path that leads to that. How do you delineate anything if it's all just one big ball of non-inherent existence? Okay. How could we experience pleasure and pain, he says, if positive and negative actions were devoid of their own inherent existence and they would just be products of our imagination, merely there because we suppose them to be there? So what meaning could there be in engaging in one and abandoning the other? Again, these essentialists, as they're sometimes called, are really holding tightly to the fact that if things don't have any intrinsic essence or existence, they cannot exist at all. We've kind of pulled apart the whole process of causation by saying things are empty of that. It's not what the Buddha said, though, again. According to this critique, then, those who propound no inherent existence are so deeply sunk in error that in their system the path to liberation is lost to sight, and even the distinctions between right and wrong and existence and non-existence lose all meaning. Again, it makes some sense from their vantage point. We're not, we can poke holes in it, as Nagarjuna is going to do in the very next verse, but from their logic, if intrinsic existence means existence, if things can't exist without that, then things don't exist at all. Another way we convert it to this, one of those synonyms, hypothetical synonyms, we went through a few of them last night, is objective existence, meaning it exists in the object. The essence is there objectively. And again, that's how the world appears to us, and that's how we relate to the world, right? Like I say, there's the maroon color of all these backings. It seems like it's objectively out there, and I am knowing it through my eye sense consciousness, and then, of course, in my mental consciousness, giving it this label. But it's got to have some maroonness out there for me to be able to identify it as that. And the Buddha says in his final word, no, there's nothing from the side of that defines it as maroon, that gives it that color. It's all the experience of beings that cause things to exist, maroonness, whatever, any phenomenon. Here's the response finally from the consequent school after those slides. If they were not void, if they were not empty of inherent existence, all of these would not arise or pass away. Kind of using the same phrase. If we go back to that quote, This one, the opponent said, all of these, if they were void, would not arise or pass away. Here we say all of them, if they were not void, would not arise or pass away. It's kind of the exact opposite to what the lower schools are thinking, or to what we think instinctually, what we think is really happening in our world around us. So for you, the lower schools, the other schools, it follows that there would be no four truths of the noble ones. The whole Buddha's teaching and the logic of it that began with that first wheel turning of putting in motion a schema for how to understand the world that we're in, that wouldn't exist if there wasn't emptiness of inherent existence. We already saw that a little bit with the quote that we had, right? When this idea that for the person for whom emptiness is possible, everything's possible. For the emptiness, or the person for whom emptiness is not possible, nothing is possible. It's essentially getting at this point of view, that there would be no Four Noble Truths if things didn't lack inherent existence. Kind of the exact opposite to our thinking and what we think instinctually. There's got to be something from the side of the object, got to be something out there. There's got to be a real I in here. Otherwise, what is this? Again, what Lama Tsongkhapa, and of course the Buddha before him, and Nagarjuna, and all these great masters are putting forward when we talk about the subtlest level of dependent arising is, again, mere designation. It doesn't mean that it's just a label on that, because once more, there's always a basis for the labeling. But this stuff, again, is a completely separate phenomenon from I that is a label I give to this. There is no real I here, folks. You are not here in that way. You're here through what we tend to call nominal existence. Nominal existence means simply by name, designation, label, imputation. That's the only way that things exist. It's very, very, very slight. I don't know, maybe you heard this, Don, from Lama, but I think it was Jampa Gendon who told me this in the master's program. He said, it was in one of our review classes, he said Lama used to say that for Westerners, because we hold to things as being so concrete and real, that you should head for the nihilistic, end of the pool, and then just dial it back a little. I don't know if you ever heard anything quite like that from Lama, but it makes a lot of sense, right? Because if we go to that extent of saying nothing exists, and then it's just the slightest way of existing. Nominal existence is just enough for things to exist. So I think there is something to be said for like the understanding of this deepest level of dependent origination is really quite profound. That there's really just mere designation, nothing more than that. Again, always on a basis. We never deny that there's a basis. There's a basis for what we call samsara. There's a basis for what we would call nirvana, and so on. All these things have a basis, but they're merely designated as such, merely imputed as such. They don't have any intrinsic essence. So again, as we go through this weekend, there might be a lot of head-scratching periods where we kind of go, well, I'm still trying to figure out where all this goes. But the reality is that if we don't go that far in negating things, we're never going to be free of this ignorance. Why Tsongkhapa, I think, is going into this teaching at this point is because he really has to, kind of reaffirm what the Buddha said. He's already praised the Buddha for making this incredible contribution to our wealth of knowledge that we can have from his teachings of saying that that which is dependently arising is empty of inherent existence. And that is something he's now reaffirming and saying, we have to get this. This is the most wondrous, most marvelous teaching we could ever have. Okay, let's go back to the slides because I do have a couple things to share, I think, that come from Lobsang Gyatso, Venerable Lobsang Gyatso. Tsongkhapa's verses show him filled with wonder at the discovery that, just as Nagarjuna argues, the exact opposite is the case. Nothing makes sense without emptiness of inherent existence. The rest of this book, and that was the book that he wrote on these verses, Venerable Lobsang Gyatso, is essentially Tsongkhapa's condensed articulation of Nagarjuna's critique of the opponent's view. Kind of poking holes in that because, again, that's where most of us are. whether we've studied these lower tenets or not, we still are, through the force of our habit and ignorance of being with us since beginningless time, still adhering very strongly to the sense that things got to have intrinsic existence. There's got to be something from the side of the object, even if it's very slight. Now, this idea of nothing making sense without that emptiness of inherent existence is contrary to all of that. Let me take it off screen here. That's a different section. I might explain to you very briefly kind of what the Svatantrika view is, because this is like the view that even Lama Zopa Rinpoche in some of his talks, he would say that he would talk to masters that he had, his gurus, and they would say, oh, you're still kind of holding on to the Svatantrika view. You're not quite getting to the final middle way view. Again, Svatantrika is this other subdivision of the middle way. What are they negating? It's kind of an interesting exercise because it shows you how we are still holding on perhaps to that. And that's what Rinpoche would always say. The Svatantrikas are saying that the way things exist in a manner of dependent origination is through some level of imputation, without a doubt. They don't deny that there's imputation. They just don't go to the extent of saying mere imputation. By mere imputation, we mean nothing more than that. No inherent existence. We are simply, things are designated. There's a basis for it and a designation made. That's the only way that things exist. Well, in Svatantrika, they would say that, yes, there is an element of imputation and conscious awareness of things that is a part of bringing them into existence. But there's also something from the side of the object, just something there that causes us to impute it in a particular way. So again, going back to our example of the maroon that's on the chairs here in the Gompa, these backings, we see that color maroon. We impute maroon on it, without a doubt. They say this is understandable. And again, to what was brought up last night, maybe there is some logic, to what Jeffrey Hopkins said about that not being too horribly hard to understand, that we are about labeling. And as I said, even Wittgenstein, was kind of embracing this concept of our language and our thinking about things being involved in our creation of the world around us. But they still would hold that there's something from the side of that out there that allows us to then identify it as maroon, give it that label. Otherwise, the consequence again for them would be you can label anything, because it doesn't have any essence that becomes that particular thing that we label it as. There's got to be some essence out there. They're kind of like a 50-50 sort of thing. There's something from the side of the object and something from the side of our minds calling it that. But if you don't have it from the side of the object, then it becomes an incorrect conception or incorrect way of knowing our world. These two are working in tandem for them. An objective existence together with a subjective existence. And I would say, like Rinpoche would say, I'm sure he was just giving us food for thought. He probably never thought this way. He was probably just putting it out there as food, grist for the mill. That we are all holding to some degree to that level of not wanting to let go of that. Again, to Don's point, it's the gakcha. It's the object of negation. Things having some essence from their own side is what we have to refute. And the way to refute it, as is being said by this verse, is to understand the dependent origination through causes and conditions, or any of the levels. But essentially, it can even be at that level, that things arise from causes and conditions, therefore they can have no intrinsic existence. There can be nothing from the side of it that is that object that we are identifying it as. It's our designation, our imputation in the conventional world. As I said, if I started calling everything different names and nobody else agreed to it, well, then I'd be in my own little world, It's actually somebody I knew at Levi Strauss who kind of came up with his own language. I found it really fascinating. But I'm like, who do you talk to? He had all these little words that he was using, and I'm like, I don't know, it's a little bizarre. But, we work with conventional agreement. We refer to things as what they are based on their function, the way we've come to identify them, all of that. And we agree with that, and that gets us by. We organize our world that way. But things aren't organized that way from their side. It's our organization of the world. It's our subjective awareness. So the Prasangikas, rather than this 50-50 deal that this other branch of the middle way school is going to, is a 100-0 deal, really. When it comes to identity, it is absolutely 0 from the side of the object, 100% from the side of the subjective awareness. Okay? That's really hard. I think it's hard to get to that place of saying there's nothing from the side of the object because it seems like it's there, like it's so real, like it's absolutely grounded in the object. Its essence, its appleness in the apple seed that brings forth the apple sprout and the whole chain of process that results in apples on your table. There's got to be some appleness to it or else we wouldn't have apples. So getting what the lower schools are saying isn't that hard if we really come to understand how we buy into that, how we are still holding on to something, that life preserver, before we get out to the really deep end and the Prasangikas tell us to let go, that it's okay, that we'll actually be just fine, we're not going to drown, because dependent arising is there, things still exist. We won't fall into that nihilistic bent if we recall that. So these teachings are really spelling that out for us in this 2 lines that we have, this 2 lines of verse 5, that essentially things are, I'm going to get it back on the screen so we can refer to it. Well, actually don't need to put it on the screen. You can just find, I've got my copy of it here somewhere. Whatsoever depends on conditions, that is devoid of intrinsic existence. This is the words in Thupten Jinpa's translation. So whatever depends on causes and conditions, sometimes we use this word conditions to refer to kind of the cooperative of things that come into play, like the potter and the wheel and the water and all these things that contribute to the pot being made. And then the cause, the main cause being the substantial cause of the clay that becomes the pot. But however you delineate causes and conditions, you're talking about an entire causal process that brings about all these impermanent phenomena that we relate to. That mere fact of their dependence upon causes and conditions is the reasoning for understanding them having no intrinsic existence, for that gakcha to be negated. So, again, we're not kind of wanting to throw out the entire corpus of what the Buddha taught that these lower schools are subscribing to, because there's a usefulness to it. It's kind of like a ladder. Again, if we were to all be introduced from the beginning to the lowest tenet systems and go, wow, that's already kind of profound. And then we go, oh, well, that's even more profound. And then we get to Prasangika and we go, oh my gosh, you're blowing my mind. You know, I can't, you would kind of appreciate the depths of the Buddha's compassion and his ability to use skillful means to teach everyone. So we're not negating that these points of view aren't useful or that they don't have some validity even. What we're negating is that they're not the final view. They're not the one that's going to undermine the whole thing, kind of pull the rug out from underneath our samsaric experience. And we have to go that far. But he's saying, by virtue of this whole embracing of dependent origination, he's saying yes, and all the things that the Buddha taught as well, including rebirth and bodhicitta, compassion, all of the other sort of method aspect of the path, as we call it, all of that can be upheld without a doubt, because that's all part of the chain of causes and conditions that Buddhahood depends upon. But none of that, too, exists inherently or intrinsically. So again, don't ever fall into a nihilistic bent in thinking that these teachings don't matter. Rather, it's only when we kind of bring all of that awareness of the other elements of the path, that method aspect, together with the wisdom, that we then have everything in line for us to do what we need to do. That's what's set out in this verse that you saw briefly when I was going through the slides, this wonderful verse from the 6th chapter of Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way, where he says, and as when a group of blind folk all are led with ease by one with sight to where they wish, here wisdom takes the sightless qualities and likewise goes to the subduer stage. The idea is that if we look at all the other practices of the path, the method aspect, they're sightless in a way. They're without that vision to be able to see things as they really are. You could practice those for eons, and without the wisdom realizing emptiness, you'd never get there. You have to unite these two and respect them all, again, within the confines of dependent origination, that it takes both wings. So I'm just, again, throwing this in here. I thought it was a nice thing that Lobsang Gyatso included in his commentary, and I hope that's kind of clear. So this phrase, though, that's in the verse, let's get the verse back up on the screen. When we say, again, we'll put that up there in just a second. whatsoever depends on conditions. Again, we might think then that the Buddha is only talking about impermanent phenomena, because remember when I talked about the 3 levels, I talked about how the first generally is referring to those that arise from causes and conditions. When we have this phrase, just conditions, though, it is kind of open to a bit more interpretation. Why? Because we can see that there are other kind of conditional factors that play a role in all 3 levels of dependent arising to be there. I'm just mentioning this, it might not be a huge, profound point, but when we talk about something being imputed, right? Well, there's an imputing consciousness to do that, right? My mind and the minds of everyone who agrees we're going to call that maroon, that color, that is a condition by which maroon comes into existence. Prior to that, the basis for maroon existed, but it was not designated as such, did not come into existence as maroon, did not get its identity in a sense until there was that condition. So it's kind of interesting. We can see that it's not just these causes and conditions that the Buddha is talking about in that statement that Tsongkhapa is kind of quoting. That which relies upon conditions even includes permanent phenomena. It includes everything, because everything needs some conditionality to arise. To explain this further, we're going to go back. I'm sorry to take you back to the handout, but we're back on the handout on page 5, I believe it is. So let me go to that. Whoops, pull that down. Okay, we're going to take a little break soon. Maybe we should take a break and come back and do this. Because right, we're here for about another, is it? No, it's, we end at 4. And what time is it now though? Is it 3? Oh, okay. Sorry, my computer is still set to New Mexico time. Big mistake. Let's take a little break. Okay, so when we come back, we'll work with this passage. And in the meantime, let me take like 10 minutes. Is that enough for a little restroom break? Get some refreshment. So those of you who are online as well, you can take a little stretch break. Okay. Yeah. Okay. It's always hard to have breaks that are just, yeah. It's always hard to have breaks that are within the time that you would ideally just like to keep talking and checking in with each other, but. So one thing that I was discussing with Don Brown outside, which I want to make sure, I think I've got some slides or something that relate to this, but I do want to make sure that we don't get this kind of false impression around this topic of like realizing emptiness and dependent origination, that it's purely like this, solely the wisdom wing. You know, if you don't pay attention to the other side, then you don't create that requisite merit, that kind of energy, that sort of gas in the tank to get this realization. Even Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he was at the Light of the Path retreat a few years back, said that in terms of calm abiding, this very stable mind of meditative concentration that we need to develop to realize emptiness at a deeper level, that takes merit. Many people go off on retreat, they think, oh, I'm just going to, check out. I've got a really great place where I can go into retreat and be solitary, for a good period of time, and it's all going to happen. And they don't get it. Why? Because they didn't have the requisite merit. We forget about that factor so much in our culture, right? Because we don't think about it. It's kind of like if we look at, we do all these various things, but we need the money in the bank, right? If you just keep accumulating bills, well, it catches up with you. You never really, have the ease of mind. If we have the requisite money in the bank and we do the things we do, then it all works out fine. Well, we need the money in the bank, the gas in the tank, whatever it is that will get us to those levels of realization. So don't forget that that's a good part of it. Lama Tsongkhapa's life story itself is quite an example. In fact, there's the rock, I think, is still there in Tibet. The Chinese, I don't think, were able to destroy the rock. They destroyed a lot of things, but there's the rock where Lama Tsongkhapa would make these many mandala offerings, and they said, that the rock was made smooth through the force of his skin going across this. You can't imagine what that was like when he first gets to the rock, and it's one of those kind of maybe porous rocks or something that's really quite rough, and he managed to make the rock smooth through doing hundreds of thousands of mandala offerings. I don't remember what the numbers were. The numbers are outrageous when you look at this is Lama Tsongkhapa, folks. This isn't like, I just look at it and go, this guy's knowledge is amazing, right? He's incredible, and that's how he got it, right? You don't think that these things are two separate things. This is what he had to do to get to that place. If we have all this admiration for Tsongkhapa, which many of us have, it's because of that he was able to achieve it. So don't forget that that's another aspect of all of this, because we tend to get really narrowly focused on just kind of cramming the wisdom in and getting all of it and not thinking that there's anything else involved. Yet our teachers often are emphasizing the opposite, right? Make sure that we do all the other practices, all the merit making, and so on. So this was the passage again where we're talking about this idea of it being a little bit greater when we talk about relying on conditions. So here there's this indented passage, by the way, in this book, Emptiness Yoga. He's commenting on a text by Jamyang Shepa, I think is, I believe, the author. It says, and that's the text from that author, dependence indicates a reason for the absence of inherent existence of things. That is the dependent designation of all phenomena. They're being established as mere designations in dependence upon their own bases of designation. So usually this third one, that's what was being recounted here, was that third level of dependent arising or origination that we talked about this morning. And usually that's explained as establishment as mere designations or imputations in dependence upon the conceptual consciousnesses that designate them, in dependence upon labeling, imputation, and so on, rather than independence upon their own basis of designation. The second one then is described as dependence reliance on parts, or we could call those bases of designation. Remember when I was using the clothespin, I was simply talking about now think about those parts of the clothespin as a basis of designation. We're just kind of thinking about the parts in a slightly different way to fit into this idea that there's then a designation, a label that is given to these parts that is the basis of designation for clothespin. The parts are the basis of imputation, but you can pay attention to the parts merely as parts or as the basis of imputation. right? Because when we're thinking of them simply as parts, we can assemble them, whatever, but we think about them in relation to being labeled as clothespin. That's another way of relating to them. So basis of imputation or basis of designation brings to mind the process of imputation of names, whereas just talking about the parts as parts does not necessarily do that. Still, for a consequentialist, dependence on causes, dependence on parts, dependence on basis of imputation, and dependence on imputing consciousness all draw in the topic of the process of designation. And this third interpretation of dependent arising as the dependent designation of all phenomena is unique again to the consequent school. These lower schools would not subscribe to that deep level of designation. Again, even Svatantrika Madhyamaka would say, yes, the designating consciousness is involved to some degree in imputing, but there's still something from the side of the object that is worthy of being designated as that. Okay. So again, this get us to some of this that we've just been discussing. This is a feature of only this supreme system. It is not common to autonomous and below. This was actually meant to be completely indented. This is the passage from Jamayakshapa. Although the third interpretation of dependent arising is distinctive to the consequentialists, this does not mean that you cannot take the second, for example, and find in it the consequentialist distinctive meaning, the third interpretation. Although the consequentialists use all three and see all three as deep, Jangya is speaking within the context of differentiating three levels of meaning of increasing profundity. So they all drive at the same point, but they are kind of a more entry level than the more advanced level and the deepest level. So continuing, again, because I haven't really gotten to the full point of everything that I want to get across with these passages. Thus, this term causes and conditions, or it was simply conditions in our text, the verse from Tsongkhapa where he was citing the Buddhist saying that reliance upon causes or on conditions means that things are empty of inherent existence. It has actually a threefold meaning. First, as the producers of an object, right, where we normally talk about causes and conditions. The causes and conditions for the clothespin were the wood and the metal and all the various things that contributed to it being here. They all they're kind of there before. So it's kind of interesting. Thich Nhat Hanh, in his teachings, he often talks about interbeing. I don't know if you've ever seen some of his teachings where he'll say, like, if we use a piece of paper as an example, when we see a piece of paper, we shouldn't just see a piece of paper. We should see the tree that the paper came from, the rain that watered the tree, the sunlight that helped the tree to grow, and so on. All the various things we should be seeing as an interbeing. It's the same concept. And at this first level, that's what we mean, is that within something is, as the product of all of that, are all the causes and conditions that preceded it, that gave rise to it. Then, when we go to the next level, let's go back to our text, we see that if it goes to the next part about first as the producers of an object, then as the parts that are the basis of designation of an object, and then thirdly as the conceptual consciousness that designates an object. So we kind of have a threefold way of seeing some sort of conditionality involved. First, there's a condition of the things that produce it, the things that precede it. Then we have the things that are kind of the designation for the whole, the parts that the whole is based upon. And then the conceptual consciousness that is actually designating them as such. It was interesting in talking to Don during the break as well, he was saying that Jeffrey Hopkins says that he actually finds the second level of dependent origination, where we look at dependence upon parts, to be a little easier to work with than the third. And it does make some sense because they kind of coexist, right? If I look at this clothespin again, I've kind of got them all here together. All of the parts are in my hand, right? And we're looking with this idea of, can you have a whole clothespin? Can clothespin be there, that whole, without the parts? We can get kind of that interrelationship. Perhaps some people find that an easier way to get in. But I do think at some point we have to get to that third level to see the extremely subtle way that things exist. Again, just nominal existence. But the second way is definitely a bridge to get there. Because when we start seeing that, as was pointed out in that text, that the parts And basis of designation are really just two ways of looking at the same thing. The parts that constitute the whole, and the basis of designation, which is the basis for the label. Everyone get that kind of, again. But the point that's being made here is we can call all of that reliance on conditions, or even causes and conditions, the imputing consciousness that gives the label, the kind of whole that is designated to the parts, the clothespin that is designated again to these various parts, that is then dependent upon those parts. And then, of course, the causes and conditions that are very clearly causes and conditions. You don't have to get much else involved in that. It's all a matter of some level of conditionality. Even emptiness, again, is conditioned in that it requires minds to designate emptiness. Emptiness does not exist from its own side. Another nutcracker to get through, to really work around. Emptiness itself is not some absolute truth that we can like point to and say that that is standing on its own. That is an inherent characteristic of all things. It is a characteristic of all things, but it's not there inherently. It too is merely imputed. Sounds wild, right? The Buddha is about really pulling the rug out from under us in every way, shape, or form. You know, there's nothing really. I think there was. I like to read Pema Chodron's books because she's such a wonderful teacher, but she comes at things from a Kagyu point of view often. She even has some Nyingma teachers, I think, but she calls it sometimes groundlessness, and I kind of like that idea too, because it's like the ground's being pulled out from under us all the time. But as was said by Chogyam Trungpa, which was her teacher, I shared this last night, right? There is no ground, really. There's no parachute, there's no nothing. I mean, we really, at some point, we do get to a pretty major negation of things. But as was said, you know, by Lama Yeshe, I guess, you know, we just dial it back a little, because things still do exist, albeit in a nominal way. Because obviously, if we only use the reasoning of the first, dependence upon causes and conditions, you can end up with the same conclusions that the lower schools do, right? That things still have inherent existence, even though they rely on causes and conditions. It's important for us to understand that, to really get that, but we can see that everything that is involved at all three levels of dependent origination is pointing to some conditionality, something else needing to be involved for something to come into existence. Whether it's an imputation on a basis, the whole that is there because of the parts, or the causes and conditions that led to it. I mean, when I was talking to Don, I was saying that there does make some sense, because even though, like Thich Nhat Hanh says, you can have this interbeing concept and you can see in the paper the rain and the earth, that it came from the nutrients, all the things that, it's kind of hard to hold that awareness all the time. But we can see the parts of a clothespin, right? I can delineate them right here without even taking them apart. You know, I can just say, yeah, there's these three main parts and subparts to those, of course, and what have you. In one of the analyses that's used, what's called the 7-point reasoning or sevenfold reasoning of Chandrakirti, he goes into an examination first of what it's called a chariot, but in modern times we'd use a car, right? We don't have chariots. We don't, you know, go down. I need an electric chariot. That's the big thing now, right? Not just a chariot. I don't want a gas chariot. I want an electric chariot. We get cars, right? And we can relate to cars. But we see that there's this unitary phenomenon that we call a car, right? It seems to have a unitariness as car, and car seems to be over the entire collection of parts. But because the parts are kind of coexisting there with the car, it might be easier to do an analysis from the point of view of the second type of dependent arising. Because then we can go, yeah, I can see there's 4 wheels and 4 tires, and, you know, there's a steering wheel, and there's, you know, all the various things that are parts of the car. And none of them individually are the car, and all of them are a part of making the car. You might be missing a few parts of your car and it still functions, but, you know, nonetheless, just like with our bodies, we might miss a part of our body if you were in an accident or in war or something and lost a limb. We don't say you don't have a body anymore because you don't have an arm or a leg. But nonetheless, at some point, it ceases to be there if you take the parts away. The parts and the whole have an intimate connection. Cannot have one without the other. That's the other miracle of what Prasangika is saying, is not only does the whole depend upon the parts depend upon the whole. Because how do we refer to things as parts of a car without a car being there? It's an interrelationship, mutual relationship between those. So I would encourage you in your investigation beyond this. I was actually hoping, I don't know what I was thinking, that we might have more time to even do some meditation together on some of these levels of dependent origination. But you have all the raw stuff from this by the time you leave tomorrow after the final class to be able to meditate on it, to really investigate it. And we'll talk more to Alex's point about how do we bring that into our daily lives even. So this is the point behind what we were looking at in verse 5ab. Again, it's a rather belabored way of working at that, but actually in most of the commentaries, that's where a lot of the commentary comes in, is because this is sort of the fundamental statement that speaks to the equality of dependent arising and emptiness. Whatsoever depends on conditions, whatever those levels of conditions are, again, causes and conditions that we normally identify, the parts that wholes depend upon, or the basis of designation and the imputing consciousness that goes on with that third level, there's always conditionality involved. Always something that is involved in bringing things into existence. Therefore, all those things are devoid of intrinsic existence. They can't exist independently on their own. Oh, I just thought of something I wanted to share that's actually quite nice. Some of you who were here with the talk, some of you who were here for the talk on faith in Buddhism saw me hold up this book, and I held it up earlier, The Logic of Faith. I grabbed this just before I left thinking, oh, I'm going to do a little talk on faith. It might be kind of nice to hear what this woman has to say, and it's not so long a book. It's about 120 some pages of actual text. And then I look at that, what she's talking about, and I find that she's talking about instilling deeper faith through the teachings on dependent arising. So it became like this twofold thing, and I managed to read the book before my talk on faith, but it's also been quite nice. I'll share one quote in the slides from her. Now that I've given that whole introduction, I forgot what I wanted to share. It'll come back. Anyway, I would recommend this book very much in terms of her approach to dependent arising, because she really has, and she uses this word about 20 times in here, she has a sense of awe at the fact of dependent origination. Because it is pretty quite astounding when you think about it, that everything is a product of these various levels of just arising and coming into existence. She mostly works with causes and conditions, but the idea is that, things still exist. They still can be posited. It becomes a bit of like this, again, that verses from Nagarjuna that I had on the screen some time ago, that were the introductory verses. No coming, no going. No is not. I mean, you find this middle way where you're not quite in a realm of things being as concrete as they were, but they're also not totally gone or something. You're abiding in a state that I think is really quite profound. So I would encourage her, reading her book in regard to that. She is a student of Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, which I think is a Nyingma or Kagyu master, I'm not sure. It's also the teacher of Pema Chodron these days. So I like her book a lot. Thupten Jinpa did the introduction to that, just so you know. Let's go back to the verses enough. And whenever I think of what it was that I wanted to share from her book, I'll hopefully remember it, and it won't be at an inopportune time to share it. Last two lines of this, is once more Tsongkhapa saying, having set out this very simple statement, what excellent instruction can there be more amazing than this proclamation? Again, when we imagine Tsongkhapa having had this profound experience after that dream that I recounted, and going into this deepened period of investigation and meditation, and then coming to write this, this poem that essentially covers the essence of what the Buddha taught. By the way, there's an interesting article that I found online as well that I have here by a man named, a person I should say, Nomoto Hiroshi. And it's called Buddhism and Poetry in Tibet, a study of Tsongkhapa's text that we're working with here. And essentially talks about how this is quite an amazing feat of poetry as well. If you know the Tibetan and what have you, I guess it can be quite interesting. This is a genre that did develop of kind of the songs of spiritual awakening that did exist in Tibet at the time and were taken to great heights by many of the masters there. So there's something to be said even for the poetry that maybe doesn't come through as much in the English as it does in the Tibetan, with the equal number of syllables and all of this, you know. You could probably chant it, I would imagine, because of that. That's why we do a lot of chanting of Tibetan texts, is because of the same count of syllables in the verses. Though there is one point at this where the verses increase in terms of the number of syllables. I'll point that out. Not that you need to know, but. Okay, the second part of this, expressing amazement that the reasoning unwise people use to confirm the conception of inherent existence is a perfect reason for the wise to ascertain non-inherent existence. This is what we've been getting at, right? The lower schools all say, oh, because it depends upon causes and conditions, it has to inherently exist. The appleness has to be in the seed. Whatever it is, the maroonness has to be in that color for us to identify it as that. There has to be something from the side of the object where the causes and conditions wouldn't bring about the results. And the Buddha and Nagarjuna and Tsongkhapa and all these great masters of the middle way say, nah, it's because there is nothing inherent that causes and conditions can then bring about things. They don't have to have anything inherent. The myriad, the diverse number of phenomena can come into existence, and we can be awed at them, you know, because of their being dependent arisings and, you know, lacking inherent existence. These things are totally complementary. So this is the verse that pertains to that. Verse 6, by grasping at it, the childish, interesting, in some translations they actually call it the foolish or the fools, strengthen bondage to extreme views. For the wise, this very fact is the doorway to cut free from the net of elaborations. So again, this is what we are looking at in terms of the ability that we have through really investigating these teachings and entertaining the full meaning of dependent arising, to be able to undermine our ignorance, grasping at inherent existence. Whereas many people will look at the teachings on arising from causes and conditions, and it strengthens their adherence to inherent existence. It says, no, things have to have that from their own side because they arise from causes and conditions. Because again, if that appleness isn't present in the seed and the whole process, then you never get the apple tree, because it's impossible for it to exist without that. That's the point of view of the lower schools. Whereas again, the wise ones are seeing the exact opposite. So as we pointed out previously, we did look into these extremes of nihilism and eternalism, or annihilation and permanence, and I've been kind of going back and forth, you know, either side with this. And this is speaking again of those who keep falling into the eternalistic view in terms of their own view, and professing Prasangika to have fallen into the nihilistic view. This is, you know, again, they're thinking we're over here, but we see very clearly that they're still over there. They haven't let go of that life preserver yet. They're afraid to let go of that. They think that things don't exist if they let go of that. But Prasangika, of course, from their perspective, has let go of it, and now how can they posit anything existing? How can they make the Four Noble Truths exist? How can they have any cognizance of things without that? So it seems like I've got one more thing to share from the handout from this. There's actually even a final part of the handout that we'll get into a little bit later in regard to one of the titles for the outlines, the headings. Whoops, that's not the right one. Let's go to page 5. That was page 6. I'm sorry, 6.5. That's what I wanted to go to. So regarding the lower schools' view of dependent arising as confirming inherent existence. This is what Tsongkhapa is talking about. He's calling them childish, calling them fools, but essentially they are not willing to get the full import, or are not able to get the full import of the teachings on dependent origination. So from Jeffrey Hopkins' book, Emptiness Yoga, he says, the lower systems say that, to the contrary, dependent arising is a reason proving true existence, proving inherent existence. When a proponent of the middle way school says, and particularly a consequence practitioner, says the subject, I, is not truly existent, that's again the predicate, that's our thesis. The subject, I, is not truly or inherently existent, meaning existing without the force of being designated and existing true as it appears. Why? The reason? Because of being a dependent arising. The lower systems answer that there's a contradictory entailment, meaning that if you say things are dependent arising, that doesn't equate to them lacking true existence or inherent existence, independent existence. Because for them, again, that doesn't jive with their experience of reality. For them, whatever is a dependent arising must be truly existent, must be inherently existent. That apple seed must have its appleness. Okay? So this is Geshe Jampa Tekchok's, or Kensur Jampa Tekchok as he was known as later. This was a teaching that goes back to, that's that one other book that's on your book list that is pretty much impossible to find, but it's published by Nalanda Monastery, and these teachings go back to, I think, in the 80s or something. 1990 was when it was published, so I think it was actually in the 80s, 84, the summer of 84 at FPMT's Nalanda Monastery in France. This is his commentary on that. I really like this, so I'm sharing it with you. He says, childish beings, those who lack wisdom, have their reasons for maintaining the conception grasping at inherent existence, for not wanting to let go of the life preserver, right? For the wise, those same reasons are a method for cutting the conception grasping at inherent existence. We all understand that if we plant grains of rice, we can only grow rice. We cannot grow peas or barley. Also, the inner fact is commonly known that virtuous and non-virtuous karmas clearly produce their own results. From virtue comes happiness, from non-virtue comes suffering, and so on. So then he continues saying, knowing these things, those who are unwise think that phenomena exist from their own side and are inherently existent. They think that the fact that rice seeds only give rise to rice plants means that rice is inherently existent. Thus, the understanding of the straightforward process of cause and effect leads the unwise into the mistaken conception that grasps at inherent existence, because they think that, again, the process of causality is working with some essential essence. You know, that the essence of wood that became the wooden pegs of the toothpick, clothespin. I don't know where that came from. That essentially there's something there that is wood that became this wooden thing. If the wood wasn't there, then in some intrinsic way you couldn't have the wooden peg of the clothespin, all right? Couldn't have a wooden toothpick for that matter either. Okay, so thus the understanding, as I just said that, okay, this is the meaning of strengthening bondage to extreme views as set out in verse 6. So again, when we look at that verse, going back to that verse, we see, we see that they strengthen bondage to extreme views, that the childish are grasping at inherent existence by hearing the teachings on dependent arising. They think, oh, if things depend upon causes and conditions, that means there's got to be something essential there that produces the whole process, that allows apples to grow from apple seeds and so on. If you didn't have that appleness, you couldn't possibly have the apples growing from the tree. Oops, click on the wrong one again. Okay. Oh, let me get this out of the way. Okay, so for prasangikas, these are the wise. They're calling us wise. It's not meant to be kind of a prideful thing. It's just examining from the point of view of we're the ones who have discerned the final intent of the Buddha's teachings. And therefore, we're in a unique position to be able to learn this for ourselves and to hopefully have others realize it as well. For prasangikas, understanding that different causes bring their different results is a means to cut the various elaborations of the conception of inherent existence. For them, it is a method for ascertaining that things do not exist naturally, and for ascertaining the non-inherent existence of all phenomena. All right, and we've been discussing that already. I don't need to re-elaborate all of that. The reasoning of dependent arising is to help us to arrive at a place where we see that inherent existence is impossible. It's only because of things arising in dependence on other factors that things can even exist in the first place. Their inherent existence would deny that. Again, for those who don't subscribe to emptiness, nothing is possible. Nothing makes sense. Because if there is inherent existence, nothing could change. The world we live in would be very, very different. It's even impossible to imagine what that would be like. You know, because if it was all inherently existent, it would be fixed in a sense in what it is at the moment. Things could never change. It is why, I'll take it off screen for just a moment, that is why they do encourage you to meditate on subtle impermanence before you meditate on emptiness. It's not an equivalent realization. It's not like once I've realized that things change momentarily and, because of arising from causes and conditions and so on, that I've therefore arrived at the final view of emptiness. But it helps you kind of begin that process of unfolding that, because this is a fact that speaks to the lack of inherent existence. Because phenomena change, they cannot inherently exist. If they did inherently exist, change would be impossible. Transformation would be impossible. We looked at this earlier, right? So we really have to get that that's the gakcha, that's the object of negation, that's the thing we have to see, is when we negate that, then change is possible. Then dependence is possible, arising is possible. Okay? So we're never getting rid of kind of, again, functionality or any of these other things. We are getting rid of a mistaken idea that we have about the phenomena that function and so on. And there's a quote that Geshe Jampa Tekchok gave from the Great Exposition on the Stages of the Path. This is what we often just call the Lamrim Chenmo, the Great Treatise. And this, by the way, those I'm sure everyone knows, but that has been very handily translated into English in 3 volumes. And this would be from the 3rd volume, I'm sure, which is the one that covers calm abiding and the special insight into emptiness. In that text, Lama Tsongkhapa says, when the unwise recognize that compounded phenomena, those things that come from causes and conditions, depend upon those causes and conditions, they confirm their conception that grasps that inherent existence. They reaffirm it, they strengthen it, again, as we saw in our text. Whereas by understanding that compounded phenomena are dependent upon causes and conditions, the prasangikas realize the non-inherent existence of those phenomena. The unwise includes all followers of tenets, from the Madhyamika Svatantrika, those again of the autonomy school, the middle way, down to the Vaibhashikas. All these other schools are strengthening their own adherence to inherent existence by thinking that things arise in dependence on causes and conditions. So it's like a puzzle. Well, how do they take the same reason and prove 2 different things? For them, the syllogism would be, all things exist inherently because they depend upon causes and conditions. For us, it's the opposite. All things lack inherent existence because they depend upon causes and conditions. So again, we have to see, well, which camp are we in? Where do we want to be? Well, obviously we want to be with the wise, right? I'm team wise, versus team childish and foolish. But it takes a while to get there because we are so used to the childish perspective. Childish is actually a much kinder word than fool, right? But it's essentially saying that those who haven't grown up to matured to the higher view. But again, the Buddha taught this as all part of skillful means to help us to let go of more and more and more. We're going to see this as we get into the remainder of my commentary on this verse, because I've got quite a bit for this. As I said, once we get past these first initial verses, it won't be quite as much commentary. But I think it is important that we look at all the fabrications that we do have that can be, in the end, everything undermined by the reasoning of dependent arising. Nonetheless, the Buddha did teach, ways of negating various things so that we can move in that direction. Until they get to the wise level, they still will hold what would be called kind of childish views of things that are not fully spiritually matured in terms of our understanding of emptiness and dependent origination. Okay. So let's go back to the text and just point out where I want to kind of take it from here. So again, get that out of the way. Let's go back to the text. Again, we just talked about the first part of this and the second part to some degree, but this last part where it says, to cut free from the net of elaborations. When we talk about elaborations, of course, we're obviously talking about what we were discussing earlier, and to, I think it was Laurie's question about conceptuality. A lot of our conceptual thoughts are elaborations, things on top of what is there. Of course, inherent existence is something we put on top of what is there. That is the basic elaboration. But we have a lot of other elaborations, particularly once more in regard to the I, and I already touched on one of these to some degree earlier. But the idea here is that the Buddha once more taught how to remove different elaborations that are problematic, and some of which we do carry from life to life. Some, like that coarser one that I talked about and that we'll go into in a moment, is something we have to learn. People learn a lot of fictitious tenets in the course of a life these days, right? Depending on who you listen to and what sort of tenets you follow, you might start coming up with some pretty crazy stuff that's outside of the realm of what the Buddha teaches. That's why I really do encourage, people when they begin their exploration of Buddhism to kind of stick to kind of one tradition, one point of view as much as you can, if you found something that you like and that you feel is in tune with you. And don't even go necessarily to other schools of Tibetan Buddhism, because they might approach things from a slightly different way that can be confusing. And then when you try to bring in things that are outside of Buddhism, like even beyond, like those who prescribe to Theravadan teachings of the Buddha and what have you, if you get way out to like things that are just doing some kind of New Age philosophy, it's anybody's guess as to whether what they're teaching is in line with what the Buddha taught or not. You have to have kind of more discerning and critical mind. And once we've understood one system really pretty well, not that we have to kind of get every little detail of it, then we can bring in other things. They say this in the monasteries even, like when they teach a text, study it from the point of view that it's taught. Don't start pulling in a commentary from some other monastic school and comparing and everything. It gets to be too crazy. Really understand it well from one point of view, and then you can entertain other views. I've begun to examine a little bit of the Kagyu approach to emptiness. There's actually one book where they kind of put Tsongkhapa down, and I'm like going, that's interesting. What do they find faulty in Tsongkhapa, right? So there is, some benefit sometimes, because you can even maybe strengthen your own understanding of things by hearing opposing positions. Kind of like when I mentioned, His Holiness teaching on the Christian Gospels to a group of Catholic practitioners in Ireland quite some years ago. Some of them came out of that teaching saying, listening to His Holiness speak about the Gospels made me even had deeper conviction and feeling for the teachings of Christ. That's a great teacher. That actually helps people to really find some truth and deeper understanding in their own tradition, even though he was speaking about things from a Buddhist perspective. I don't know. Anyway, let's go into a deeper investigation of kind of these various layers, if you will, of misconceptions. And here we're going to kind of work on the I. That's because when it comes down to it, this is the main thing that everything is circling around. All of these kind of feelings and what have you. This should say verse 6, by the way, I think. I think I moved it around a little bit. Just should say verse 6. I'm sorry, I'll change that on the final thing when you get your slides of this or whatever. So the first view of selflessness we will look at, and by the way, we're going to use this word selflessness because here we are talking about kind of both things. We're talking about the self that is the I, but more we're talking about a fabrication around that I that is denied. So when we say selfless, we don't mean there's no I at all again. We mean there is a lack of the I, the person existing in particular ways. The first view we'll look at is the one that discerns the non-existence of a permanent, unitary, independent, which is literally the word for it is own-powered, I, that is distinct from the flow of the five aggregates, our body and mind. This is the one that I talked about earlier that's called the Atman in the Vedic traditions, or the sense of a soul. Permanent meaning unchanging, unitary meaning has no parts, it is a one thing unto itself, a unitary phenomenon, and it is independent, as being kind of existing, independent of causes and conditions, independent of the aggregates and so on. I'm going to define these words, the five aggregates, I think in a little bit, but the second of these focuses on another level of misapprehension or elaboration we have around the I, which is called here the self-sufficient, substantially existent I. And kind of saying that that doesn't also exist within our continuum of body and mind. What is this self-sufficient, substantially existent I? Because we have talked a little bit about the Atman, and there's going to be more slides coming up in a minute, but it is important that we also, just as I was saying, like it's good to, go back and really study these other points of view of what the Buddha denied for these tenet systems so that you kind of work your way up. It is important that we understand things that perhaps we even carry with us. And it said that, the first one, the sense of an Atman or soul, is something that you have to learn. Someone has to tell you have a soul. You're not naturally born with this feeling like, oh, there's some other part of me that isn't my mind or my body, is something else that's here with me. And I got all that indoctrination again from the Catholic Church, and they had good reason for doing this. They wanted to save my immortal soul. I mean, thank you for your compassion. But, I question that and have come to the conclusion it doesn't exist. We do have to, some of us, investigate that first one because perhaps we're carrying that acquired tenet or view. The second one is actually, Tsongkhapa says, we're born with this one too. We are born with our other ignorance that we've been talking about all weekend, the ignorance that's grasping at the I to exist intrinsically, inherently, independently. The second one is this idea that there's kind of this controller here that is together with this mind and body. Jeffrey Hopkins actually uses the idea of a sales force. Like we have a sales force, there's generally a head salesperson, right? Who kind of oversees the sales force to make sure they're all kind of doing what they need to do and relates to them in that way. But the head salesperson is part of the sales department, right? That little unit is all kind of there together. So this isn't something that's kind of completely distinct. You're kind of hanging out with the other aggregates. The self is kind of there with them, having a relationship with them that is more like the boss and the workers, the Lord and the servants, that kind of relationship. And we have a lot of our language that's kind of about that, right? And in fact, it's the one example His Holiness uses in the book that's on your book list from him, the Middle Way, Faith Grounded in Reason. He uses the idea that if someone were to come to you, especially those of us who are dealing with kind of older bodies, and said, I'd like to give you a new body. You replace the old body you have with a new body, right? We kind of think that there's an I there that would happily do that, right? Yeah, give me a, whatever, teenage body or something. That's the other one, he says. We can also do that, right? We have this feeling like there's an I here that would benefit from trading out our bodies, getting a different body, right? Or trading out our minds. Well, that's that sense that there's something there that is kind of together with them, that is the owner of them, the one that is involved with them, but that you got some ability to have that, that the I has some status that is not kind of the aggregates themselves, but is kind of there together with them. In fact, these words, self-sufficient, substantially exist, I don't want to get into too much detail, but they're essentially pointing to something that can kind of be known to some degree independent of the aggregates, an I that has some sort of status as that boss, as that head salesperson that is distinct from the aggregates. The I that owns the aggregates, that can say, yes, give me a new mind, I'll take a new mind. Of course, you have to download all the information you have maybe first so you don't come into it completely like a baby or something. But it's a weird concept, what would it be like to get a brand new mind? I don't even know what that's... But that speaks to the fact that we think there is something that is the I that has some independence of those factors, can be kind of detected, sort of separate from them. Another way that we do think about it is we often do have that relationship even of thinking of like my mind and my body. My body is really killing me today, or my mind's a mess, or whatever. And that already speaks to some sort of being that's kind of here together with it. Again, not completely separate, but playing that role of the overseer. That's a sense of I that we all have. It's not the deepest view of I, obviously, that we have to refute. But if you don't refute that, then again, it's maybe harder to get to a final view of emptiness, because this is a form of selflessness that we do need to negate. Just like those people who have subscribed to a sense of an Atman or a soul perhaps need to negate that before they can do a deeper investigation at this subtler level. As I said, Tsongkhapa asserts that this is something we do carry from life to life. It's a coarser view of selflessness. It's not the final version of self that we are refuting, but it needs to be refuted nonetheless. So these are the two that we're going to talk about, and hopefully it'll become a little clearer even through the explanation on the screen. The third, of course, that goes beyond this, which is what we're studying this weekend, Tsongkhapa insists that we must continue to analyze until we realize a third still more subtle level of selflessness, the I's lack of inherent existence. This is again that there's nothing real that is the I, because sometimes, because even if we get into that analysis of thinking there's no real kind of substantial I there that's this overseer, we might still think that there's got to be something in the aggregates that's the real I, something there such as the mental consciousness that we can point to and say, but that's the real I. We were even entertaining that idea a little bit earlier today, right? Each of these three levels of insight into selflessness overcomes its opposing misconception. We proceed by refuting the false self that the particular misconception grasps at. So the first step is to bring the false self clearly into view. This is called identifying the object of refutation or negation. So we can even use this term gakcha. We use it quite specifically to refer to the one that we're all about negating in the prasangika view. But any one of these is a gakcha. It's something to be refuted, to be negated, depending upon where we're at in our progress and refining our view of the I and how the I exists. So once more, the three objects of refutation going from coarse to subtle are thus as follows. The permanent, unitary, independent self, which again, not all people may have. Because if we didn't learn that in this life, we might not have any conception that there's something that is completely outside, soul, an atman, what have you. I mean, say outside, meaning like it has a real independence from the body and mind. It can carry on beyond that. Again, that's why I had problems, again, saying yes, that this, you could call the continuum of awareness the soul, because it really doesn't meet the measure of what we mean by soul and those traditions that hold to that, or what they mean by soul. Because if it has an ability to go on this life when consciousness is ended and the body has shut down, well, then again, it can't be mind. It has to be something else, some unitary, completely independent self. The second one is the self-sufficient, substantially existent self, which again is the overseer, the head salesperson that seems to be there. And then the third is the inherently existent self. We're going to conclude in just a moment. I just realized it's 4:00. So, though the thinkers of the lower schools contemplate various levels of dependent relativity to reach their insights, this does not prompt in them the suspicion that the self altogether lacks inherent existence, because again, they're only refuting to a certain level. They're only willing to shave off a little bit of elaboration and not go for the whole thing, because they don't think that that's a problem. They think that things do inherently exist. So why would we remove that? Then things don't exist at all. Then nothing makes sense. When they refute the permanent, unitary, independent self, they refute any self having a separate nature from the aggregates. When they refute the self-sufficient, substantially existent self, they refute a self from within the aggregates that has independent control over them. But when consequentialists penetrate to the third, the subtlest level of selflessness, they understand that not just persons, but all phenomena, including the aggregates, have no own nature whatsoever. And that like blows their mind. They can't get there. But the consequentialists are able to get there, but the lower schools see this as, again, consequentialists diving over into the abyss of nihilism. Just a short slide or two, I think, and then we'll conclude. In complete contrast, the other schools say that form, feeling, discrimination, mind or consciousness, and many of the items in the other aggregate, the compositional factors aggregate, are all substantially existent. In this way, they claim a substantial foundation remains, even if a person is only imputed. They will agree that you have kind of a person imputed on the basis of the aggregates, but they again say there's something kind of findable within the aggregates that is the real person. These are the 5 aggregates, in case you don't know them. I think most people do. They are the skandhas, the collections, the aggregations that are encompassing all conditioned phenomena at a certain level, everything that arises from causes and conditions. But on an individual level, a personal level, each of us has a basis of these 5 for the person. We have the form that is our physical body. The other 4 are all mental. The mental factor of feeling, by that we mean the sensations that we feel, the feeling tones of pleasure, pain, neutrality, the mental factor of discrimination that discriminates this from that, then all the other mental factors and any other compositional factors that are not form or consciousness, which again, in regard to a person, would not include those. Essentially, we have that meaning the other 49 mental factors. Remember I said there were 51 the other night. Those include all the other kind of ways we parse up the mind, various factors within it, virtuous mental factors and so on. And then we have consciousness itself, the bucket in which all of these mental factors are arising. Okay, I thought there was, let me see where this is going. What number was that? I've got to kind of go back to my thing here, pull it up on my screen so I can tell. This is number 43. Let me see where I'm at in my notes. I got 4 more slides. That's maybe too much to do. Okay, let's just conclude. And I'll just have to dive back in at that point. Okay, because I don't want to keep people here too late. It's been a long day. So let me put my screen back onto Zoom. Any questions before we conclude today? Again, what we're concluding with, at least kind of in an interim here until we resume tomorrow afternoon, is this idea that the Buddha is trying to help us to get rid of all these elaborations, the coarser ones as well as the subtlest one, because the subtlest one is what's going to actually get you to the final result, get you to liberation and enlightenment. The others are useful, though. They're rungs on the ladder, but they're not the final view. Ended up with my computer screen on there. Okay, anyone? Yes, Don, the microphone. Yeah, great.
So I'd like a little bit more clarification on the term I-grasping or self-grasping ignorance.
Self-grasping ignorance.
Yeah, and I mean, it sounds like a semantic game, but I know I've heard it's not. It's a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, again, it probably would depend upon the context. This term self-grasping ignorance, in the Prasangika's point of view, of course, what we are referring to is the grasping at a self, meaning a fictitious way of existing that is a part of our ignorance. So we would say that grasping the self to inherently exist becomes the self that we want to refute. That is the self that we are grasping at. So it's not. So when we say self-grasping, I don't think we mean the nominal I. We don't mean the mere I, the imputed I, because we aren't grasping at that. We're grasping at the fictitious I, the gakcha, the inherently existent I. So whenever we're saying self-grasping, whether it's a self-grasping of persons, which is the I, or other people, or phenomena other than the I, which is everything else, chairs and so on, we can, I suppose, relate the same term, a self-grasping ignorance, grasping at the chair to inherently exist. Because we're grasping at a self that is fictitious. Now, there are contexts where it's used specifically to refer to the self that we refer to as the I, and then it would be only the fictions, the elaborations that we have around the sense of I, primarily grasping at it as inherently existent. I think we use this term much more in the context of talking about the middle way point of view. I don't know, where are you speaking about a specific use of it that you've heard that you would, or just the general usage of it?
General use of it. I mean, I think, I think I can understand, that we have an I that appears to exist inherently, and then, but then there's something like this clinging to it, like
absolutely.
So ignorance projects this false sense of I, or gakcha, this self-existent I, but then there seems to be an added layer of grasping to it that creates. Is there a distinction between that, or is it the same thing?
I've always seen it as the same thing. I don't see it as like grasping being a heightened version of thinking that things inherently exist. I see the thinking as the grasping. So I don't know. I mean, I haven't really ever had that question, so I have to maybe think about it overnight as well. But in the usages that I've heard, and certainly when Rinpoche speaks about self-grasping, I think, or even oftentimes we talk about in the Lojong teachings, mind training teachings, that we have the twin demons of self-cherishing and self-grasping. That just simply means that holding things to inherently exist. In fact, that's how Thupten Jinpa defines it in his book on mind training, is that self-grasping is, whether it's persons or phenomena other than persons, it is thinking of those to be inherently existent. I don't think, I thought you were initially getting at the self part of it, and you seem to be now moving to the grasping part of it. But I've never really seen someone refer to that grasping that's being referred to there as something that's a heightened version of thinking. It's just the way that we hold the self to inherently exist. A self of phenomena, self of persons. And again, by self, we mean an identity, a fictitious identity that we think resides in the object. So that's how I've heard it, but let me think about it overnight. Won't keep me up, don't worry. I go to sleep pretty easily. But I'll see if I can. But in recollection, Thupten Jinpa really seems to equate it to the conception of inherent existence and not make it into any sort of heightened state of mind. Even though we often use, like in the 12 links, that I went through that craving and grasping, like it's a heightened form of craving. I don't think that that's the case here. I think it's just holding the I or any phenomenon to inherently exist, and that's what we mean by self-grasping. But it's a good thing to noodle over. Any other questions or comments? So I know this was a lot of words for everybody today. I mean, I'm sorry for throwing so many words at you and concepts and what have you. Try though, even though it was a lot, to reflect on things. If you were taking notes or whatever, looking at the text now after you've received some commentary, just go back and try to look it over tonight a little bit if you can, or tomorrow morning before class, just to see, are some things sticking? Are there some questions coming up? Because you've got this opportunity now, not that you can't reach me when I'm not here, but here while we're together, to investigate these things. So I do want to make sure that, we are able to answer those questions as much as we can. So, all right. Let's do our dedication prayers.
Page 246 in the Gold Prayer Book.
So as we've been doing, bring to mind all those beings that you're holding in your heart before we recite this. There's just so much suffering in the world that's really, direct, that we can see with our own eyes. Unbelievable pain and suffering in so many parts of the world, as well as in those that we know who are going through difficult times, having illness, challenges to their physical well-being, as well as mental difficulties. We want to bring all those beings to mind as we recite this, making this sincere prayer and dedication that all these merits may ripen into the removal of their suffering, as well as the suffering of all beings, and that they and all beings may find all the perfect causes and conditions to achieve perfect well-being. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, obtain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may these never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. For as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Maybe tomorrow we'll do the actual long life prayer for His Holiness and the swift return prayer for Rinpoche. But now let's dedicate this merit as well for His Holiness's long life, as well as all of our teachers who are with us still, so that we and others will benefit from their amazing presence in this world. We also dedicate for Lama Zopa Rinpoche's swift return, so we can be reunited with this amazing embodiment of compassion and wisdom that has guided us for so many years and will continue to guide us in the future. Okay, thank you all so much. Appreciate your patience in being with these teachings today with me. So thank you all online and on YouTube. Be well.
Thanks so much, John.
Okay, good. I hope I'm doing okay in terms of the translation into Spanish. I'm not talking too fast or anything. I try to remind myself to slow down when I can. But anyway, thank you for doing that. Okay, good.
All right, everyone, we will start Sunday morning with our regular Sunday Dharma connections at 10:30 until noon. Don will be teaching on adopting an attitude of gratitude, and then we will continue the last part of the weekend workshop at 1:30 after our lunch break. So be sure to bring a bag lunch if you're going to be here and through both sessions. Thank you.
Okay, please go leave. I mean, don't have to wait for me because I'm going to get things together because I'm going to go see Geshe Gelik. And so I want to kind of be heading in that direction and not mingle too much. But I'll mingle more tomorrow. So, okay, thanks.
Good night, all.